Hello, everyone. This is Brent Runyon. I'm the Executive Director of the Providence Preservation Society, and we are expecting a few more people to join us, but I want to go ahead and get started, respect your time this evening. Before getting underway, we want to acknowledge the Providence Preservation Society is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Narragansett Nation. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous people, and PPS's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. This year's symposium explores the systems and inequities that have shaped our built environment and the communities that inhabit it. It's never important, considering the events of the past year, to reflect on whose places have historically been prioritized, and for us who work in the field to recognize what needs to change moving forward. The interdisciplinary approach to this year's symposium gives us a good framework for thinking about the intertwined nature of issues such as climate, housing, design, transportation, reflective diversity, and historic preservation, and their possible solutions. The preservation movement has to reorient itself around the questions people care about in order to affect meaningful change in our neighborhoods and cities. I want to bring your attention to tomorrow's symposium session at 5:30, where pop culture impresario Gerald Cooper, founder and creative director of Hood Mid-Century Modern, will talk about the intersection of pop culture and representative preservation. Tickets are available on our website and will be available until 10 a.m. tomorrow, and I hope you'll join us. This session is being recorded. We encourage you to enter your questions in the Q&A and any other comments in the chat box. That will help us keep track of questions to answer, and we'll get to many of them at the end of the program. We also want to thank our many sponsors for supporting this year's symposium, and you can see those on our screen. A year ago, I sat in a hotel conference room in Denver, the good old days when we could assemble and travel, with colleagues from around the country. To a person, we all expressed a frustration that was hard to enunciate, that historic preservation was being increasingly seen as less relevant than other pressing issues of our time, affordable housing, racial and environmental justice, and others. The conversation has only progressed from there, with the national conference most recently devoting most of its sessions to topics that would have been deemed perhaps less relevant to our work a decade ago, but which are very relevant today. In tonight's conversation, we accept that this field must change, and we turn our attention to ideas and proposals from a diverse group of big thinkers. On our website, you'll find longer biographies for each of our panelists, so let me just describe them a bit. First, Desiree Aranda is a city planner and cultural heritage consultant based in Phoenix, Arizona. She is also a co-founder and current co-chair of Latinos in Heritage Conservation. Catherine Fleming Bruce is author of The Sustainers: Being, Building, and Doing Good Through Activism in the Sacred Spaces of Civil Rights, Human Rights, and Social Movements. She is currently directly involved in preserving 2 significant buildings in Columbia, South Carolina. Sarah MARSOM is a heritage resource consultant based, founder, I think I missed something there, heritage resource consultant. She is founder of the Tiny Activist Project and organizer behind #Dismantle Preservation. Dr. Jeremy C. Wells is an associate professor in the Historic Preservation Program in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at the University of Maryland, College Park. And our moderator tonight is my friend and colleague, Bonnie McDonald, president and CEO of Landmarks, Illinois, who recently traveled the country pre-COVID to understand how preservation can be more relevant. And we couldn't think of a better person to moderate tonight's conversation. So the panel will go for about 60 minutes, and afterward we'll have time for audience questions. Please don't forget to use the Q&A feature for your questions. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Thank you, panelists, and welcome, Bonnie.
Hi, excuse me. Good afternoon, everyone, and to Brent and Kelsey. What a privilege it is to be invited to be in this space today with you to talk about a topic that is imperative, and that is what needs to change in historic preservation. So if I may just let you know that the identity that I bring today, if you're asking questions later, is that I use she, her, hers pronouns, and also that I identify as a preservationist in this space. As well as with regard to the titles that Brent mentioned, I come to you from Chicago, Illinois. and lead the statewide nonprofit Landmarks Illinois, but also I have the privilege of working with Brent in another capacity besides friend and colleague in this way. I also am the chair of the board of the National Preservation Partners Network, which is the nonprofit organization that helps to create a networking space and capacity building for the traditional and organized preservation movement. So that's a bit more about my background, and I'm so pleased to join this important conversation. And once again, I want to thank Kelsey Mullen. So in addition to Brent and coming up with this very needed topic about what needs to change and why, it takes a lot to organize these, as we know, and it's really important in my mind to start with an acknowledgement of the people who do this work. So Brent and Kelsey, thank you so much. And also to the board of directors of the Providence Preservation Society for their support and recognition of the nature of these progressive conversations and the role that we all play in taking action to do what we can to change this field. And, you know, coming to this question, what needs to change? I just heard Brent say that we accept that as an imperative. We accept that as a fact. And I want to say that in the research that I've done, unfortunately, not everybody does accept this as a fact. And so it's important to have these conversations to lead people into the questions that they are hopefully going to ask themselves, as well as engaging with other people around the conversation of who's not at the table with us, who needs to be at the table with us, and why aren't they at the table with us? So if I may, for just a second, who is at the table today? The aspect of table setting is really important in this conversation of what needs to change. So I just want to acknowledge who I'm sharing this space with today and what a privilege it is to be with them. So to Catherine Fleming Bruce, to Sarah MARSOM, Desiree Aranda, and Jeremy Wells, thank you so much for being here. And it's really going to be a pleasure to hear your responses to this question of what needs to change. And they will each self-identify. So I'm not going to do that. We want to hear from them how they identify in just a moment. I want to take just a further few minutes to delve a little bit deeper into this idea of what needs to change. Brent very kindly referenced a project that I have been working on as part of a fellowship. The James Marston Fitch Mid-Career Fellowship has allowed me to travel the country pre-COVID, as was noted, but also use Zoom recently to interview 130 people, both inside and outside of preservation, to contribute to this thought of what needs to change. So I so appreciate that, this space to further those ideas and bring you some of the information coming from people in our work and outside our work from all around the country. And the format today is referencing that. So we'll get to that in a little moment, a bit unconventional how we've brought this presentation and this panel to you today. Now, our field is reckoning with this aspect of how relevant we are or we aren't. And I would tell you that I'm sure that my panelists today join me in being those who accept that change is necessary, and that we're each taking steps to help do that today and in the future. But as I said, not everyone feels this way at this point, that we do recognize that we're being challenged in our work, that there's diminishing support for our work financially as well as politically oftentimes. Preservation ordinances are being challenged, designations are being challenged. The YIMBY movement on the West Coast is having success in challenging the validity of historic preservation districts. As we talked about, not everybody's at the table to decide what happens with their historic places, their resources, their stories. And that is an imperative aspect that we need to change. Very questions about our regulations, such as, if some of you know, the Secretary of the Interior standards, how the integrity standard is applied, how the criteria is applied, and again, who decides what is or is not significant. Those are some of the aspects we'll bring to the conversation today. So I wanted to seed that conversation and let you know what the format is going to be. So for the next 60 minutes, our wonderful panelists will have the opportunity to, number one, introduce themselves. And I've asked them to each answer a question, which I'll start with Catherine in just a moment and let you know what that question is. for a little consistency, but then we'll go into a discussion where we've picked words that we associate with change needed in preservation. And we'll show you the list of words that we have to choose from, and hopefully it will spark questions in you for the last 30 minutes of the presentation today, where you'll be able to answer, give us questions and we will answer, and hopefully we'll have an engaging dialogue for you today, and leave you with some ideas yourself on what you can do to change preservation in your own way. So with that, let me make sure I've taken care of our housekeeping. We just talked about our schedule, and we'll go deeper into our format. So I now want to ask our panelists today to self-introduce, and I'm going to start with Catherine Fleming Bruce. Catherine, would you let us know the answer to this question? In my vision of the future, I see preservation as being what? Catherine, you're on mute.
The cardinal sin of Zoom. But thank you so much for making me first, and everyone else is going to have to improve upon my speech. So that's going to be great. I'm here in Columbia, South Carolina, and my answer to that question has to do with making the invisible visible. And what I have encountered as somebody who has actually been involved in some of these projects as well, is that once a project comes online, you have a lot of activism around that to keep it going. The gaps in scholarship are filled in. And one person whose building was not preserved may just fade away into history, and someone else is going to become a much larger figure, causing us to ask additional questions about our recent or far recent past. So I'd like to see it as, that's how I would like to describe it.
Catherine, is there anything further you would like to give to the audience about your background or a perspective that you bring today?
I think quickly, I am a activist first. I am a preservationist second, I would say, and an author as well. So I have traveled around the country and in other parts of the country. I'm very interested in politics and particularly international relations. And I think all of these things are tied together, and that's what I try to do, is tie them together so that everyone can engage. Well, and I'm a she, her, and I'm a she, her.
She, her, thank you very much. I was going to say, I know you are a dynamic storyteller, and that is all about the arc of a narrative and tying things together. So we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to go next to Desiree Aranda.
Hello, everyone. So I'll start off like Catherine did with my vision of the future. In the future, I see preservation as a progressive movement and profession that is oriented towards social justice and made up of diverse, multiracial, multi-ethnic community of professionals and advocates. I see a movement and a profession that is holistic and multidisciplinary, one that looks at preserving whole places and communities rather than just the physical fabric. And finally, I see a movement and a profession that engages communities that have been locked out of the process for various reasons, and that makes room for people to tell their own stories.
Desiree, is there something that you would like to describe to the audience about your perspective you're bringing to the conversation today?
Sure. So my pronouns are she and her. And I'm currently a co-chair and co-founders of Latinos and Heritage Conservation, which is a national nonprofit dedicated to preserving Latinx stories, places, community, and culture. And I do want to give a shout out to one of our board members who's based in Providence. Her name is Martha Martinez, and she's the director of Rhode Island Latino Arts. And I'm currently based in Phoenix, Arizona. This is my hometown. I just recently moved back after 8 years of working in the San Francisco Bay Area, first with a local nonprofit organization, SF Heritage, and then as a preservation planner with the local planning department. And my education and training is also in planning. And I would say that my work has focused on using the tools of historic preservation and planning for social justice, for racial, ethnic, social equity. That is what drew me to the field. That's what keeps me in it. And most of my projects have consisted of context statements, designations, and other community-based documentation and storytelling initiatives, mostly focusing on history and communities of color, and doing collaborative work.
Phenomenal. Desiree, thank you. And thank you for, just want to say that as you all hear about the work of Latinos in heritage conservation, how impactful it has been. So thank you for co-founding that organization. And speaking of another visionary and founder of many things, I'm going to go next to Sarah MARSOM and invite her perspective and answering that question.
Hi, I'm Sarah MARSOM. I'm a heritage resource consultant based in Columbus, Ohio. My work specializes in education and outreach strategies, working to make both the physical and intangible elements of our past connected to people today for community empowerment. So when I think of the vision of preservation in the future, I want it to be tied to empowerment, to people understanding how the past impacts them today, to help them understand how to be a voice to advocate for themselves, their neighborhoods, and their broader communities. Some of my greatest hits include the Tiny Activist Project with Tiny Jane Jacobs and Tiny I Am Pei. This summer, I was happy to be the organizer and creator of Dismantle Preservation, which was a one-day event which had more than 1,000 people live streaming to discuss different elements of preservation. Like it was alluded to earlier, some of these conversations have been on the back burner. Well, I threw some fuel, some fire, some gas, basically everything on the fire to have conversations about mental health, about unions, about implicit bias, things that we aren't having conversations about. And that has also been tied to a labor equity campaign. I truly believe that in order for preservation to be valued, we have to value ourselves, and that includes salary transparency. So I've been advocating for job boards to require compensation and to no longer allow unpaid internships. And I also I jokingly call myself I'm not the art history teacher, I'm the history art teacher. And as you can see behind me, I've had a lot of fun this year celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and all the advocacy for voting rights that came after it through banner making workshops.
Sarah, no judgment, but you often have the best backdrop of anyone on Zoom. So thank you for that. Not to say anything about anybody else's backdrop, but it's usually pretty fantastic. So congratulations on your success with the pay equity movement. As I will let you know on the call today that Sarah's been extremely successful in advancing with a number of organizations listing the pay on their hiring materials. So she's already having a significant impact and is a progressive in this thinking area, along with our next guest or our next panelist, Jeremy Wells. I would just say, Jeremy, we've been following you since at least 2017, thinking of progressives and historic preservation. So I would love to hear what perspectives you bring and what you see for the future.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. So I, first of all, I use the pronouns he and him. So in my work, so I'm an associate professor at University of Maryland, and I've been here for about actually I'm on my 4th year now. And so I teach in a historic preservation program, and I bring a social science perspective and community-based participatory research perspective in what I do, particularly interested in the psychology of heritage, especially the use of environmental psychology to understand how people perceive and experience place. And I relate that, generally speaking, especially just with a social science approach, to understanding what equity and inclusion is in preservation through that kind of a lens. And I'm also really interested in trying to come up with innovative tools that are applied that preservation practitioners can use to bring both a social science perspective and a participatory research perspective to the work that gets done in preservation. So, and in addition to this academic background, I've had a lot of different jobs in preservation. I've been an architectural materials conservator. I've been a Main Street manager. I led the City of Denver's historic preservation program. So, and I've worked in historic site administration. So I've had a really broad exposure to the basic broad practice areas in preservation, which have been incredibly useful for me to understand not only what the breadth and scope of the field is, but potentially how it should be changing. So, so to answer that question about that vision for the future, so I would say for if I had this idea of what is a vision that I see for the future of preservation, not surprisingly to many people, I see it as very people-centered or human-centered in its focus, with the idea of looking at the human environment, the conservation of places, with the goal of facilitating human flourishing. It's about how it benefits people. And I see that the future of preservation practitioners and the role that they play is being facilitators, working with communities in a way that recognizes and balances the power between different kinds of experts, because the people we work with in our communities are experts of a different kind. They have knowledge we need to use, and we need to respect that. And in that process, how can we work with communities to understand not only through their perspective how they recognize their heritage, but how can we help through that facilitation process? How can we help those communities help themselves, basically? So it's about community empowerment. And the last thing I'd like to say is a lot of what I've been influenced by is what Ioannis Poulios refers to as a living heritage approach. So this is a Greek academic researcher that's done some case studies in Greece. And he emphasizes that we need to focus on how do we get power in the hands of community members? How do we focus on maintaining the connection of intangible heritage between intangible heritage and community members? And how do we re-envision what our focus is on looking at heritage being an inseparable part of people's lives in what they do?
Jeremy, thank you. Wonderful. And the tying you all together, I'm excited to talk about what I heard, but what I would like to do is speak to our audience directly, just to state that we hope that you see yourself in some way in this panel, that between the multiple ways that we come into preservation, whether it's activism or we're part of an organization or we're part of an agency, or we come in as academics or writers, activists, that I hope that in some way you see some of yourself in this panel today, and that we can reflect on what you want to get out of this. I just want to reflect on what I just heard from each of these incredible people. Between them, their vision for preservation, what I heard has a lot to do with power and who has that power. Who has the agency to decide what happens to places that they care about, that they identify, that they care for. That's part of their heritage, their identity. So we heard empowerment from Sarah. Jeremy just talked about the power in the hands of community. Desiree, you were talking about community engagement, which is respecting the power that people have already and listening to them. And Catherine, making the invisible visible, once again, is about respect and about recognizing people's right to place and the authority that they have as oral historians for their own story, and also ensuring that they have a powerful seat at the table. So that would preempt the next part of our session, but I just want to make sure I engage our panelists to say, did I get it right before we move on? We do have a minute here. So panelists, all right, okay. So we would like to take this opportunity to engage you in this process. So I'm going to ask Kelsey, thank you. So Kelsey's going to bring up a series of 50 words. And this is how we're going to frame the next portion of our dialogue between the panelists. So in thinking about some unconventional ways to come at this question, what needs to change, we thought that was actually quite authentic to come up with different ways of thinking. So there's nothing wrong with a traditional panel of asking questions and getting responses, but we wanted to pose to you these words so that you could start thinking about which resonated with you. So I developed these words out of this research project that Brett referenced, which refers to the changes that people are already making in preservation around the country and what they've identified as some of the issues related to our field. What are the challenges? Where are places where we are not giving respect, where we're not sharing power, so to speak, or making sure that we're coming to the table knowing that place that we have at the table. So what I've asked my fellow panelists to do is to pick 5 of these words, and just note they could choose their own, choose their own adventure at the end if one didn't resonate with them. But I'm so pleased that they found words that they did resonate with them. So we're going to begin, actually at this point, we're going to begin with Desiree and ask Desiree to talk about the 5 words that she's chosen for several minutes. And then we're going to open it up to the panel to engage in a conversation about those choices. And at the end, when we have our Q&A, you'll get a chance to talk to us about it as well. So Desiree, would you talk about your words?
Sure. Yeah, and I'm excited for this different and new style here. It's fun and exciting. So the first word that I chose was colonialism. Because the majority of the stories and the places that we have historically preserved that are designated and listed are by and large representative of the colonizers of colonial history. And many would also argue that historic preservation as a nation building exercise is in and of itself a tool or a continuation of colonialism. I mean, I think that's something that we really have to think about as people who, frame narratives about places, about land, who make decisions about land and history. I think we really need to think about, our place within that longer story, right, of human existence within what we now call the United States. And as I'm Mexican American, and as a Latina and someone involved in preserving Latinx history, colonialism is something that we often talk about when agencies, for example, highlight what they call Latino history that they've preserved. It's usually Spanish, in actuality, it's usually Spanish colonial history. And while we acknowledge that that is part of Latinx history in terms of our kind of part of the origins, right, of our multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and diverse community, it's really only one part, and it's really only telling one part of that heritage. And so I would say within like more current circles within Latino and heritage conservation, many of my peers and I are interested in elevating the stories of our Indigenous, Black, Asian, Mestizo, working class communities, more recent history in the United States. My second word, or the second word that resonated with me was displacement. And this, most of the work that I partook in San Francisco was really largely about gentrification and displacement. And I know that is something that is a challenge cities and towns all across the country as our cities, as our populations move more to cities. That's something that we're struggling with, right? And we have increased economic inequality as well. And in my perspective, even though yes, the bulldozer is still a threat in many places, but especially like in California, for example, where we have pretty strong preservation laws, displacement, economic displacement of working class communities, loss of businesses, et cetera, is more of the issue than say like buildings being demolished, even though that still is, a problem. And so Also, I would say in terms of like our fields and our profession, we often operate within these existing legal frameworks, and our work ties to what we get paid to do. But I think we have to always remember more broadly why we're doing this work, and that it connects to ongoing struggles of people, right? History has the impacts of history are still ongoing, and that for many people, especially communities of color and working class communities, it is more important, or at least equally important, to preserve the ability of people to continue living in their ancestral lands or where their families have lived for generations, or at the least have access and ownership over places that are significant to their communities. The third word I chose to look at was health. And I'm not a public health expert by any means, and this is really just based on my own observations and my own theories. But for many of us, including myself, I think our work is about honoring our ancestors and bearing witness to the trauma that previous generations have experienced. And in doing so, we can heal ourselves, our communities, and just bear witness to what has happened, right? And remember what has happened. And in many of the projects that I worked on in San Francisco, designation projects involving Black, Japanese American, Latinx historic sites, involve very traumatic history or a loss of a property that belonged initially to a family, and then they lost it for various reasons, right? Or there's a potential or pending displacement going on. So I think that this work can be beneficial in aiding the public health of entire communities, and in the mental health of communities where they can see themselves, their ancestors, or their familial legacies represented and preserved for the future. Then I chose the word youth, and to me, again, this is a big reason why we do this work. Who are we preserving things for? It's for the future generations, and I think our work should be more youth-centered, and have that in mind. And it also ties to the idea of passing on and preserving our heritage, passing it down to the next generation, can be good for the mental health and the developing identities of young people, and as a way to begin to heal intergenerational traumas. And then lastly, I chose diversity and equity because I think they go together. Equity in our work, in my opinion, means to work collaboratively to elevate and protect the history and places that are important to everyone, but prioritizing the voices and experiences that have been suppressed or ignored for most of our history. So to me, that's what equity looks like. It's elevating those voices and places, et cetera, that we just have not had equal access and recognition. We can't address equity if the people around the table are not diverse and representative of all of us. And we can't achieve equity or justice if the work is always relegated to a few people of color, right, in our organizations, to kind of bear that emotional labor and that very difficult work. And our field in particular is still lagging behind other fields when it comes to diversity and representation. So it's something that we really need to focus on still. And of course, diversity is not enough in and of itself. Everyone needs to take ownership and responsibility for dismantling white supremacy, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, but we need to address both diversity and equity at the same time.
Thank you very much, Desiree. You just illuminated those words for us so beautifully and set such a great tone for this conversation. I'd like to invite our panelists to inquire into those words for you, and if they have any initial questions that have arisen for them.
Well, I just want to add that thanks to the Black Panther film that was so popular, and of course we lost the individual who plays Black Panther, but one of the words that came out of that film was the word colonizer, if you may remember. And so now you have a pop culture reference when you're talking to people about colonialism. So it's a good kind of intersection and segue into bringing up all of those impacts that you suggested about our past history.
Yes, absolutely. It's a great film.
I just want to say that, so I see we do have some questions coming into the Q&A. So Barry, I want to acknowledge I saw your question and I'm saving them for the end. So we will get there. Just feel free to put your questions in and we'll bring them up in the Q&A portion. So thank you for those questions. That one, there's one for you, Desiree, that we'll get to from your presentation. You know, Desiree, you talked about preservation as nation building, which I certainly, concur with. I just wonder if everybody understands what that means in the context of preservation. Not to oversimplify, but I'm not sure everybody has thought of it in that way. Could you talk more about what you see as nation building through preservation?
Sure. So I think what I'm referring to is mostly the National Register of Historic Places and kind of the way that we list sites and the way that it's framed, right? Like criterion, all the various criterion. How does a particular site, building object, et cetera, how does it relate to the history of the United States? That in and of itself, right? We're referencing the United States, say, versus earlier communities that have lived here, indigenous communities, or even previous colonial powers that have occupied these lands. So that's mostly what I was referring to, and typically it's more about the way we frame our storytellings and our narratives as part of the United States, right? Versus, say, other communities that might look at history in a much longer timeline and look at borders, man-made borders, differently.
Well said. Thank you. I always want to leave room for people to jump in. Otherwise, I'll do it. So. The point you raised about colonizers, colonialism is, and it is very embedded in our practice because if you think about the criteria that we use, and even architectural history itself is very much embedded in Western architectural history, so to speak. So I'm going to open that up once again to say, anybody else on the panel want to talk about your thinking of how to decolonize preservation?
Bonnie, I'm happy to add on to that. Actually, I've been working with a colleague here at the University of Maryland, Michelle Magalong, who's the founder of the Asian Pacific Islanders for Preservation Organization, on how to address decolonizing preservation, specifically how we teach it. And it does center a lot on what you're talking about, the idea that a lot of the things that we teach our students are embedded in a very white European, usually male perspective on what is knowledge and what's valid knowledge in architectural history. But if you look at a lot of the preservation doctrine that we normalize in practice, there's a really interesting unbroken chain of those meanings that go all the way back to, you take it to John Ruskin. You go from, going back, if you go John Ruskin to Viollet-le-Duc to Camilo Boito, Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings. So again, these are European white men. Then we get to like the Athens Charter of 1931, a bunch of white men again that are just reinforcing the idea of what preservation is. We get to the Venice Charter in 64, more white men meeting, talking about what preservation is from a European perspective. And then we have the Secretary of the Interior Standards, which are essentially just a translation of the Venice Charter. One white man in particular wrote them. And that's where we are today. So all of the meanings that we have in terms of what's valid in terms of what we protect, how we recognize it, are European white men for the most part. And the rules and regulations that were created in the mid 60s and in the 70s, which really haven't changed in the US again, are mostly white men that were created. So you can certainly look at decolonization from that perspective in terms of the meanings that we have in preservation. There are no voices from African Americans, Indigenous people, Latinx people, people of color. It's just not there.
Jeremy, thank you. I mean, I think you're further touching on Desiree's talk about white supremacy as well in preservation. So I'm sure we're going to come to that when we have your 5 words, which are coming toward the end. Just for everybody, we're going alphabetically by last name at this point. So I'm going to call on Catherine next for her words. So Catherine, would you please talk about what you chose?
Okay, I chose place first, because a lot of my work has been focused on sites that are connected to social justice and civil rights and social movements in the book that I did. So those places have a complex history, similar to many of the places that are examined in other parts of the world where major social change took place. There's often a reluctance to look at that history and to face that history. Many of the sites that I looked at were decades in the restoration process. The Lorraine Hotel, for instance, took some 40, 50 years and was close to being demolished. The hotel was about to be sold off, auctioned off, that sort of thing. So it was in peril because people hadn't the will to look at that particular history and the death of Dr. King, and as a trauma, as Desiree was talking about, these traumas that are difficult to face, but they cause us to risk losing that particular site altogether. The same with the Audubon Ballroom in New York that was connected with Malcolm X's assassination. There was a big community debate and fight about preserving that. And again, that went into several decades before even a portion of it was able to be preserved. So our responses to them, but also the transformative power of those sites, not only in preserving the history and being a place marker so that the things happen there would not be as readily forgotten or passed over, but the transformation process that we go through as people who are engaged in that process. There's also a transformation there. And I consider it, as Desiree says, nation building. I consider preservation an extension of civil rights action in many of these cases. And often many of the people who were involved in these preservations were not the typical preservationists. They're not people who went to school to study preservation. They don't have a degree in that. They're doing something else, and I'm certainly in that number. I love history, but that was not what my degree was in. One of the other people who was involved in the Lorraine Hotel preservation was an attorney. So you have people who are outside of this whole spectrum of preservation, and they do the work as an extension of social change. It's to them, to all of us, very connected to that. Gentrification, and again, that goes back to some of the comments that Desiree made about displacement. But I particularly think about gentrification in terms of lack of wealth and the resources to do the preservation. often what happens is that someone else who has the resources is able to push those people out and do the preservation. So the community loses its ownership of that property and the interpretive power that they might have had there. Wealth and reparations, I wanted to bring those two together because one of the earlier interviews that I did with my book was with Diane Nash. Diane Nash is, as some of you may know, a civil rights activist connected with the Selma movement and SNCC, and is still very active in sharing her wisdom. And I was very excited about doing this book about preserving civil rights sites, and she kind of dumped some cold water on me and said, well, basically, that's something that white folks are doing. White folks are going to get the property, do the preservation, and get the resources that come out of whatever that project is. So tourism dollars or jobs or whatever comes out of that is not going to go back to that community. And so, I had to really think about that and address that in my book. And so to say reparations, not in a typical way that we have been talking about reparations, but how do we talk about that as a preservation community, as people who are talking about how we can enable and engage and empower other people by providing resources and then making sure those resources go back to those communities to provide the wealth that is so desperately needed there. And for justice, again, I think of preservation as a civil rights act, but I also think of the ability for different people to engage and speak out about what should be preserved. We talked about colonizers and colonialism, and Jeremy made some comments about a certain population being the decision makers. But I think you can also spread that out to whoever might be making the decision. Sometimes it's Black and brown folks, but how open are we? Have we kind of set ourselves up on this pedestal to say, well, we're the ones who get to say, so it's easy for us to kind of imitate the colonial attitude and posture and say, well, we're the ones who have, this degree or that, knowledge, and nobody else's opinion is really important or really impactful. So we want to look at our system of justice in creating decisions and how we engage people, how we make sure we're open to that. And finally, with health, and again, that's something that Desiree talked about, but I thought of it in two different ways. One, health is certainly a topic of preservation. And so, one of the things that I've been working on is preservation of a building in Columbia that's connected to one of the traditional Black hospitals, and was the office of one of the chief of staff of this particular Black hospital. So we put that on the National Register, and we're doing that history, and we're connecting with the other histories about Black health and how Black people and Black health professionals were engaged in trying to overcome the disparities of their particular time. So we're looking at that, but we're also now looking at the current health situation with COVID and the fact that we now have a severe and debilitating challenge to the preservation enterprise. and of course the art world and almost everything else under the sun. But for preservationists, who already have to defend the relevance of what we do, now we have buildings that have had to be closed. Some of them are still closed. And, we're trying to figure out how to negotiate that anew. Some people have gone to visual tours and things of that nature, but it's going to be a further challenge to our definition of why we're important, why we're relevant, and justifying our experiences. So those are my 5 words.
Wow, Catherine, there are a lot of threads to pull from that. So you've laid out several issues where I hope our other panelists will engage. I think about the application of resources. What you're talking about with the Lorraine Hotel, with the theater, is choices that are made by those who have funding. And
yes,
right. So in that vision of the future, the obvious answer is we want funding to go to these places. But let me ask, in your mind, how is that going to be done equitably?
Well, I think there have to be conversations about making sure that there's some funding sources provided that are earmarked for different communities. I think what we are seeing out locally, perhaps, other communities are seeing the same, is a lot of the funding going to developers because they can do the tax write-off, so, and that's also connected to the opportunity zone piece as well, where you have tax credits that are going to be offered to people who have lots of capital to spend on projects, and they're going to choose large projects. So a lot of smaller projects and some that aren't as profit justified as others that are not going to survive unless there's a earmark for those particular projects. Mm-hmm. So, that would be how I would look at that.
Thank you for that suggestion. So making sure the funding is set aside. Yes. And then who decides where it goes? I think that's a follow-up question at some point. But let me open it up, to Sarah, Jeremy, Desiree. Do you have any reaction or questions?
So, Catherine, a lot of your positioning, I think, is really tied to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The fact that people need to have safety and health so that they can level up and then eventually, be able to invest in preservation as it's currently positioned. The people who can get the historic tax credits, they don't have to worry about health and safety and all these other things. Right. So when you think about giving reparations in a new form or a new concept, are you thinking more of like the Asheville, North Carolina strategy where they are looking to give property ownership, or how are you kind of thinking through these dots, understanding how we're all at different stages of the pyramid?
Well, that is correct. And I think that you have that same variety in the communities themselves when you're talking to them about what they value, of course. So you may have Black and brown communities who say, hey, that's just not even important right now. I have these other things to do. When I was working on the Majeska Simpkins house, she's a civil rights leader in Columbia. And we were working on the preservation of her house and had a price tag on what it would take to do that restoration. And, many of the people in the activist and advocacy communities are saying, why? Why is, that could be given to, this or that charity or whatever. So it's an ongoing conversation that you have to have that helps people to make these connections between identity and representation, but also the Diane Nash question about how that gives back to the community, in monetary ways that will support other community needs. So all of those things have to be addressed, I think, in order to build up the political will that's necessary to put that item in the public budget, and also to continue to protect. Now, it may be a little easier now because of the summer that we had, where we're focusing on Black Lives Matter, and a lot of those fights are still going on across the country. And the year before with Charlottesville, Virginia, and some of the other things that happened there. So we have kind of a rolling impact of that, as well as what happened this year. So there's a wedge, I think, an opportunity for us to make this relevant for people because of these battles and the need to address white supremacy and racism and make a change in people's attitudes. Having a building and a marker and a note of history can address that.
Desiree, I see that you're off of mute. Did you have something quick that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I thought your discussion of wealth and reparations was really fascinating. And I really like the idea that one, that our culture and heritage history has economic value, and then that value should go to the people, right, who from who it comes from. So that was really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, I have to chuckle because I didn't come up with that myself. I had to be kind of hit with that by an activist. But I was like, she's right. She's exactly right. And that's what we should be moving for.
Mm-hmm.
We're all here to share our experiences. So Jeremy, can you make a quick one? Because then I need to move on to Sarah.
Absolutely. Just quick thought to totally build on what Catherine is talking about here. Taxpayers fund about $6 billion a year in preservation tax credits, which go mostly to wealthy developers. What if we would have put those $6 billion in a grant program to the people who actually need it in this country, that could actually use it? They could do it for preservation work, but actually like homeowners that actually need the assistance rather than wealthy developers. I'll leave everybody with that as a thought.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, thank you for referencing. I mean, that's a whole conversation we can have about incentives, and I hope we will have incentives and funding. So Sarah, I would like to provide you the opportunity to talk about your 5 words. So here they are.
Wonderful. So looking at the preservation movement's history, as we tell the story today, it began as a grassroots efforts to save buildings and neighborhoods that mattered to the community, starting with Anne Pamela Cunningham and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. That's what the textbooks tell us. But in reality, when we think about the preservation movement on Turtle Island, or North America as we now call it, the people who've been living here for centuries and much longer always have had preservation tied to their ethos. And that form of preservation has just been left out of the story. And we've left out many people. We've left out people who were doing comparable work to Jane Jacobs at the exact same time, like Aurora Vargas, who advocated for the Chavez Ravine in LA. So this all evolves with our history of starting the preservation movement, again, from the white male historian perspective. And that's how it was founded, when we created these constructs in the mid-1960s as a part of the National Historic Preservation Act to save many buildings, but it created a structure of gatekeeping. It continued the structure of gatekeeping that was started by the historians who started documenting the United States when we fought the Revolutionary War. So this gatekeeping has determined what building is worthy of documentation, who can determine what's historic, and how a building is evaluated. And this level of gatekeeping has transitioned the field away from creativity and toward paper pushing instead. Preservation practitioners, when we look at our academic programs and what the job requirements are for many positions, we're trained to check boxes and to write reports that will collect dust on shelves instead of creatively connecting our communities to the past, so that preservation can continue to be a tradition in a wide variety of ways, and also for it to develop community value. We must creatively push preservation toward relevance in a range of ways, because right now, the field ignores the world that's moving around it. We recently had a presidential election. I decided to look at social media accounts for every statewide nonprofit afterward. On Instagram, 2 acknowledged the election the day of, 1 the day before. On Facebook, 4 acknowledged the election the day of, and 1 the day before. How can we expect people to think that preservation has a value, again, when we do not acknowledge the greater world that it exists in? Because preservation is tied to engagement and empowerment. And we have been precious about it with our gorgeous historic house museums that I admit I enjoy going, but we're doing it all with the white glove treatment. We are requiring building materials that are exorbitant in cost in the name of preserving things as mirrors into the past, instead of recognizing that not all buildings have to be treated with the white glove precious perspective. Preciousness limits our ability to save many stories. Instead, we focus on the few. Preciousness limits who wants to be a preservationist, who wants to be inhibited by these constructs, and who wants to be a paper pusher at the end of the day. We must be willing to challenge the status quo and to try things that may or may not be successful. It's okay to fail. I am happy to share my failures with you all. And I'm not just rainbows and sunshine, but we have to try in order to cultivate relevance. And we can't continue to operate in preservation from a perspective of scarcity. Preservation work can be done by organizations that don't have that word in their mission statement. We have a wide range of opportunities to be successful. Otherwise, preservation will continue to lose its relevance and it will be unable to transition into an American tradition for all.
Wow, you wove that into a whole story, Sarah. That was impressive as well. So I was trying to follow along, and it was just like a tapestry woven together. And the whole picture that I'm getting from that, I mean, that word gatekeeping is so resonant. And the work that you do to proverbially open the gate, or how about this, destroy the gate, dismantle the gate, take the bulldozer to the gate. So this, as you're talking about I think some of your last statements about the fact that preservation doesn't have to be part of our mission statement for us to do it, and that the paper pushing on preciousness is not attractive to many people, especially those who are new into the field. So if I can acknowledge what I have seen, the work that you have done, lifting up or telling or sharing the stories of people and organizations who are just doing this work. So can you talk more about your mission to do that? Thinking about Dismantle preservation was really all about lifting up voices of people who are doing the work out there.
I appreciate your kind words as always. Just gonna make me blush. So in preservation for me, I started out with more of a Shirley Chisholm approach, bringing my fold out chair to the table that was already full. And then eventually I got the seat at the table thanks to receiving accolades like being on the National Trust 40 Under 40 People Savings Places list, the Aspire Award. But to pay homage again to women of the color of the past who, let's say, have been largely the true gatekeeper or the true caretakers of our legacy here in American history, lift as you climb. And I appreciate that I have been given a platform to be a voice for the quote unquote next generation of preservation. But I don't want to be up there alone. I want to make sure that my peers are equally getting uplifted with me. So this has required continual internal reflection, which I am perpetually doing, just talking to myself in my own head. But it's required me to change things. I think it's a privilege to be asked to speak to audiences like this. But when I'm asked to volunteer my time or to be compensated for my time, I can determine my moral and ethical standards for if I say yes or no to that job. And I know that is a privilege that I have the ability to say yes or no to work. But I do that because, again, I'm sick of seeing all white panels at preservation conferences because that is not representative of who is doing the work. So for me, if you ask me to be on a panel and it's all white, I'm going to push back. I'm going to challenge you as an organizer to expand who you consider as a preservationist. They may or may not have the formal degrees. That doesn't matter if they're doing the work, in my opinion. So I will provide a list of names to you if you need them and introduce you to people. I think it's really important for me to use the connections that I have to help connect these dots, because when I look around, who does that benefit? Sure, I benefit from it, I'll admit that, but it benefits the field as a whole and by and large. So I want to continue to expand the field by helping inspire people through innovators and new perspectives and voices, and people who unfortunately don't market themselves as frequently as I do online.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think you've given us a relevant step there about using our platform, use the agency we have to to share information, uplift others. Desiree, I look to you because I think Latinos and Heritage Conservation has the same ethic in connecting people. So do you have any thoughts on that as well you want to share?
Sure. Thanks for asking. Yeah, one of the reasons we started Latinos and Heritage Conservation was to acknowledge that, one, there were few of us kind of doing the work. At the same time, like Sarah mentioned, there are many people engaged in this work, more broadly speaking, right, that don't have a job title that has a preservation, behind the name. So yeah, just wanting to, build that community of people and have a resource for each other, and also serve as a resource for the next generation coming up. It's important to us that younger people even know that this field exists, right, as opportunities for work, because it is such a niche field. Most college students, let alone high school students, don't even know that this is something that you can go into and get paid to do.
What a brilliant segue. Thank you, Desiree. Talking about our pedagogy and our college education, Jeremy, I think that leads us to your 5 words as an educator, as an activist, but as an academic as well. So can you share your words with us?
Absolutely, absolutely. Actually, before I do that, I want to reflect a little bit. Sarah is an example of what I would call a reflexive, beyond just simply reflective, a reflexive practitioner in the field. And people who are trained in preservation, we need more of what we see in Sarah's work. It's just fantastic. My words. So I start off with human rights because to me it relates really strongly to some of the issues that people are talking about, certainly more frequently lately in terms of justice. But one of the things that preservation in the US doesn't do very well, and it hasn't since the mid-60s, is looked internationally in terms of what cultural heritage and how it's conceptualized. Back in 1948, the United Nations declared that everyone has a right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community. 2016, that was recently reaffirmed that the UN Human Rights Council says that all states need to respect, promote, and protect the right of everyone to take part in cultural life, including the ability to access and enjoy cultural heritage. And the same council in 2016 called for the development of partnerships between competent national authorities and civil society to foster grassroots institutions with the aim of enhancing the protection of cultural rights and promoting the right of everyone to participate in cultural life, including the ability to access and enjoy cultural heritage. So if you look at the discussion that's happening in an international stage around what is cultural heritage and do people have a right to it, resoundingly over and over again, there's this very common theme internationally that people have a right to heritage. It's a human right. It's recognized by the United Nations. And so what does this actually mean? What does this mean for practice in the US? Well, when you look at how the preservation enterprise is structured in the US, we need to respect how people define and use their own heritage, even if it differs significantly from authorized notions of heritage, like in our rules and regulations. And if we accept that there is such a thing as a human right to heritage, then we have to respect the right of people to control their own heritage, the meanings that they have of their heritage and what they actually do with it. And then that certainly relates then to justice and power, because when we look at it, what is the definition of justice? It's a systemic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. And it's not just the absence of discrimination and inequities, but it's also the presence of deliberate systems. That's really important, deliberate systems to achieve and sustain racial equity through proactive and preventative measures. And so if we want to achieve justice in the preservation enterprise in the US, so where is the injustice? Well, it's pretty readily available if you take a look. 3/4 of all the preservation practice that exists in the US is there because it's required by rules and regulations. And those rules and regulations were created for and to serve the needs of architectural historians, architects, and archaeologists. Ostensibly, they're supposed to be there for public benefit, but they're not in practice. And a very few number of people that are empowered by these rules and regulations control the meanings and the treatment of built heritage. And so when you look at the doctrines and the rules and regulations in the preservation enterprise in the US, they're intentionally, by design, disempowering communities, because communities are not the beneficiaries of preservation doctrine in our rules and regulations. It's a different group of people. And so the field then demands that the preservation enterprise demands that people have to change their meanings and values to be compliant with what's in the doctrine and the rules and regulations. That a member of a community has to speak in the language of the National Register standards or the language of the Secretary of the Interior standards in order for those meanings to be considered as valid within this regulatory framework that again drives 3/4 of practice in the US. And for sure, we don't have any deliberate or proactive systems within this regulatory practice of preservation that is trying to achieve equity, much less even recognize where the injustice is actually happening. And all of this relates to who has power, as certainly a number of panelists have already brought up. And in terms of inclusion, we have huge problems in terms of a lack of inclusion in preservation in the US. I've already mentioned, about how the preservation doctrine and the associated rules and regulations have been colonized by European white perspectives from usually men. But 99% of the historic preservation practitioners in the US, the people who teach in historic preservation and people who volunteer in preservation are white. Most students in historic preservation programs are white, and only about 5% or so of the nominations in the National Register of Historic Places represent some aspect of non-white history. And as I've already mentioned, the vast majority of financial incentives are designed to benefit wealthy people in this country that also tend to be more white. And the last item on there is housing is there just because the lack of affordable housing in the US is such a huge problem, and all of the built environment professions need to be doing more work in that, including historic preservation. And we certainly don't have very good policies at local, state, and federal levels that are addressing this. And historic preservation isn't doing a good job at all in terms of recognizing affordable housing or creating it. So a lot of people say, well, the preservation tax credit, in partnering with the low-income housing tax credit, we're creating affordable housing. Well, no, we're not. According to a study by Rutgers University, in the past 40 years, the preservation tax credit produced less than 2% of the amount of affordable housing units we actually need in the US. And in reality, it's probably a whole lot less than that. So those are the 5 words that I was focusing on that I think overlap in a number of ways with what some of the other panelists are saying.
Yes, very much so, Jeremy. But I think you've put a fine point on some of the others, especially I think human rights, but housing was a new discussion. So thank you for bringing that as a very imperative point to this. So for our panelists and for our participants, we have 15 minutes left in our time. So I'm going to check in. Panelists, do you mind? Can I open up to larger questions at this time?
Yes.
All right, very good. Thanks, Kelsey. So at this time we have already, I'm going to focus on the Q&A. Sarah, I see you've been in the chat. So if you've seen something in the chat that needs to come up, chat away. Let us know what's in there. So Desiree, I'm going to bring back that question that Barry asked when you gave your introduction. So what did you mean by gentrification, and how do you see it impacting Latina, Latino, and minority communities?
Sure. So gentrification and displacement are often, talked about together. I think gentrification, most definitions I've seen of it refer more to the economic changes that happen when people of greater wealth come into an area. So it might be like in a neighborhood or in commercial areas as well. So what you end up seeing is, for example, like in a commercial area, rents increase because the market is changing, is adapting. So instead of, say, continuing to rent to that mom and pop shop that has been there for 30 years, there's a new, boutique that comes up, or maybe there's a chain, a more large scale business that comes in. The same thing can happen in residential areas. And those that are particularly vulnerable to displacement or actually being moved or having to leave are those who are of lower economic means, who renters typically versus people who own property. And so I think in communities of color that have been historically marginalized, have discrimination has resulted in and being cut out of opportunities to create wealth has resulted in situations where we might not be as much of like land owning communities, or we might not own our own homes, or the buildings in which our businesses operate, and so more easily displaced. Mm-hmm. And in terms of how it impacts Latino communities, we're seeing this, well, certainly when I was in San Francisco, but even, here in Phoenix, we're seeing it in Texas, Miami, a lot of places where incomes are, or gentrification is happening, Latino communities are being displaced to other areas, more outlying areas. And it's very traumatic to any community who, or any family, any individual who maybe grew up in a certain area, and that place is so much a part of their identity and their community's heritage, but then basically being priced out of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Desiree, you made that point during the conversation we were having, and it also makes me think, Catherine, I think you made the same point about wealth, transfer of wealth, and both the intrinsic and extrinsic value of heritage. Excuse me, that heritage actually does have, it has an economic value to people. So I don't know if you want to comment on that as well.
Well, I did want to say that gentrification, I see it as anything that contributes to displacement in a community. So it could be expansion of a university in a way that, if all the people around the community, the institution, are poor and low income people who don't have a lot of power to advocate how that is done, then those people could end up getting pushed out, or kind of forced out of the area, so this larger, more important project can happen. So all of those things have to be looked at. What the money is that is available to people to help them if the taxes increase, or how to make sure they have a place at the table when plans are being developed, so that they can say, okay, we want to make sure that we still have a good quality of life here. And so this and this and this has to happen.
Catherine, thank you. Such an important point about being at the table
Yes.
early, or even setting the table, as we talked about, that the people in the community do that. Brent, welcome back. Hello. And
well, thanks, Bonnie. I'm here to support you in your moderation, but you seem to have a handle on it. So.
No, I was going to ask if you want to take the next question.
Sure. Well, this is for everyone. And Sarah, thank you for answering part of it in the chat, but Does anyone else know of any apprenticeship or internship opportunities that are focused on the goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really as a goal of helping diversify the profession?
So I highly recommend looking at the link I shared in the chat. I actually hosted a panel discussion recently entirely on how to best support emerging professionals. So that link has a long list of internships, fellowships, and materials to help you create an ideal program. There are everything from the National Organization of Minority Architects. They have programs. The National Park Service has programs. The National Trust for Historic Preservation runs Hope Crew. They also have their Mildred Kolodny Scholarship, which is for their conference and for internships. The city of Portland has a program specifically, which ended up giving Indo Windows, an interior storm window company, multiple hires. So that has a great range of resources, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists if they have any fun stories. Or
I just have to make a quick plug for Latinos in Heritage Conservation. We actually have our very first intern this fall semester, and we are hosting a fundraiser on December 10th to raise funds to pay her. And Sarah, I think, has done a really great job at emphasizing that these internships, need to be paid, and we want to continue that. But I also think like anyone can create an internship program. So if there's not one that seems to fit, when you have the privilege, the position, the power to help create one, then that's always a good thing to do as well.
Well, I'll mention that I was asked to do one of the career day to talk about history, based on my book, which is, because I'm not in the profession the way that you are, but I was still asked, and it was the first time they'd asked someone to come to talk about history. So I talked about the range of professions and did a PowerPoint and that sort of thing. So I had a high school student call me, one of the students that I'd spoke with, and she said she was interested in doing an internship and could I help her? And I ended up calling a woman at one of the university libraries who was their, they have an archival association. And so she was the president of that. And so she was able to get this young lady an internship at the university library. So I guess we kind of manufactured an internship in that regard, but yeah, that's something that everybody can do.
I think that's a great point, though, that when we think about preservation and who all's doing preservation, it's libraries, it's archivists, it's museum work, it's oral history collectors, it's artists, it's a wide range. So look for a wide range, because especially when you're an emerging professional, you just need a little bit of experience from here and there so that you can better know what direction you want to go to. So maybe archives doesn't look like the most linear fit for their longer career goals, but it may be a stepping stone toward those big goals.
Right.
So I just got a report that it looks like chat for some reason is disabled to attendees. But we have a few more questions, so I'll go through those, and then I guess if anyone wants to post comments in the Q&A, feel free to do that. Sorry about the chat function being disabled. So Sarah, another question was directed to you, but I guess anyone can answer it. Who or what have you encountered who was called to historic preservation and who have been kept out by the gatekeeper? And who are the gatekeepers that you refer to?
There is a range of how we gatekeep. For example, a number of the scholarships which provide value to people, many of them have requirements like you have to currently be enrolled in graduate school. What about second career people or people who aren't enrolled in the right program? That is a form of gatekeeping that is done by a variety of organizations. Gatekeeping can be done through the NIMBYs, the Not in My Backyard folks. I remember when I started working for the German Village Society out of grad school, it was in winter and all of my tattoos were covered up. And one of the board members said, "Oh, you're going to have to fight that potential tattoo parlor coming into the neighborhood," like that, and I am privilege as they come. So it's fair, you know, but that's off-putting to me. So think about what horrendous things may have been said by this board member to other people who may be interested in entering a preservation career. Are gatekeepings done by how our boards operate, our hiring structures, the way we recruit people to join degrees, and obviously what we've reiterated, all of us in this conversation, what we choose to preserve and what stories we choose to do in outreach and education. So all of those are different tiers of gatekeeping that we set up. Like the fact that a master's degree is required for many of the entry-level jobs in preservation, that's nonsense. That is a huge financial barrier. So you really have to think about how all these dots connect for the larger implications as to who is able to work in a capital P preservation job.
Brent, do you mind can I add to that? Oh, Catherine, were you going to add to it?
Yeah, you go ahead first.
I was just going to bring up a related, but you know, a point in a separate category that, especially for if you're here and you represent an organization or you're on the board of an organization, you know, this extends to not only your hiring practices for interns and staff, but who are your contractors, who are your consultants as well. You know, we tend to bring in people we know, right? And who's somebody who knows somebody. And that practice keeps people out of engaging with us in a level where we can support them financially. So I just want to encourage, you know, we try to do a process of expanding when we're doing RFPs to a very broad group of people, you know, as many outside of our network as possible. And that can also have an impact to support, you know, wealth generation, introduce people to new networks, and help us learn at the same time.
Okay, I have two quick ones. One is I participated last week in a Zoom conference with US ICOMOS. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. International Symposium, US World Heritage and Social Justice in the 21st Century. So it was great, but it cost me $100. So there are going to be some people who can't do that. So that's one example of gatekeeping, but I recognize it's to support the institution. Another example is that there has recently been announced a bill to expand Brown versus Board historic sites, affiliated sites. So the current Brown versus Board site is, of course, the Topeka site in Kansas. And so that school there, but there were 4 other cases that were folded in to create Brown versus Board. And those states were South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and DC. So a bill has been introduced to add some schools from each of those states that were connected to Brown versus Board in there. And one of the sites that I worked on, the Majeska Simpkins site, that site was a location for some of the work that went behind the scenes. And of course, she was an African-American woman. So I advocated to have her site added to that particular site, as well as the J. Wades Waring Courthouse in Charleston. So some people weren't too happy that I made that suggestion. They feared that it would tank the bill before it got passed. But we're still working on that conversation to let people know about these 2 other related sites and to press to have the bill passed into law, but having it passed with having those 2 additional sites added to it. But the conversation about which sites are going to be chosen and how they were chosen, you know, I'm not really sure how that conversation happened and with whom. So again, you know, that's another place to look is when bills are being introduced, what is the public conversation that happens and how broadly are people notified of that and able to participate and contribute, make suggestions.
Well, that is incredibly important. Notification and who is aware of the issue so they can participate. That's a question that we're dealing with here in Providence. We have run up against our time. We still have some unanswered questions, but I fear that we must end it here. And I just want to thank you all for bringing so much vigor to the conversation. I wish we had another several hours. I'm sure we would not exhaust all of the ideas, thoughts, suggestions, and critiques of the field. But I know we'll all be continuing this conversation in our own communities and when we gather at regional and national conferences and other things. So for everyone at PPS, I want to thank you all for your participation. It's so meaningful. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon.